Today we'll look at Toward the African Renaissance by the great Cheikh Anta Diop. It's a collection of speeches from 1946 through 1960. And a little bit about Cheikh Anta Diop. He is a African scholar by way of Senegal, historian, anthropologist, physicist, and politician. His studies were primarily on the cultural unity of Africa, which basically means that Cheikh Anta Diop saw Africa as one consistent, unified historical people, in spite of all the territorial breakdowns, all of the language barriers, with all the multi languages throughout the continent. His major contribution was just showing us historically how African people are one people. So we may look at it as Pan-Africanist, but just on the continent. He wanted to unify Africa into one nation state, one nation consisting of multiple federated states. The text is an effort by Diop to show the African world the importance of a collective effort toward national African independence and the formation of a constitution of a federation of democratic states on an African continental scale, north of Egypt down to the southernmost tip of South Africa and everything in between. So let's go through this text. It's a short text. It was roughly about 200 pages. He starts with the languages and their similarities, with a strong emphasis on Bantu languages and the similarities that are found throughout the different dialects. You know, he did a lot with Wolof languages, languages of Senegal and other Bantu Congo languages. Um, and next, he goes into the African culture, art, architecture, and music. Throughout this portion of the text, he's kind of showing us how Africa has everything that it basically needs to lay infrastructure, to lay a cultural infrastructure. He mentions music, art, architecture, science and technology. He's basically just kind of giving us a outlay of African ingenuity and how it's important for us to take pride in promoting things that are African. Through colonialism, we end up, enjoying the colonizers' art, music, architecture, style of dress, and language over what's inherently African. So his proposal is that we take the best of all of the various African um, cultural practices, ingenuity, and bring it all together into a cohesive national culture, a national architecture, music, and language. He goes on to say that all African people have the duty to take up the task of national liberation. He makes a strong appeal to the African working class. And I feel like this is very important to have a good class analysis. African-centered thinkers and Pan-Africanists make a huge mistake in not having a class consciousness. The result is that we continue to rely on leaders who are put in place by colonial governments. These leaders hold the interests of the ruling class and corporate elite. Therefore, our understanding of the common people who are oppressed under the control of the corporate oligarchs are the necessary class or force who must work together to seize the power in the direction of their own best interests. That's a huge conversation for another time. I'm trying to really sum it up, but basically, without having a pure class analysis, I think a lot of our Afrocentric, African, or Pan-African thinkers and scholars really do us a disservice, because even though they're forward thinking, they're progressive, they understand African history and culture, they're missing the fact that we're still relying on leadership that's put in place by colonial governments. So even though, and I'm not going to name any particular leaders, but even though we have, an individual take control over a government, become president or prime minister, just because they say some good things about what they want to do for the people or do for their countries, at the end of the day, they still hold the best interests of the colonial forces that have put them in place, or the colonial forces that they're tied to. Those countries like France and England, who have a dominant control over the countries economically. So we have to make a delineation between the elites, the ruling classes, the managerial custodians, so to speak, over these countries, who still hold the best interests. Again, no matter how black they talk, how righteous they sound, they still, at the end of the day, hold the interests of the class that's ruling over these countries. So, understanding this, we realize that the working class, the people who are the artisans, the mechanics, the teachers, um, the farmers, the nurses, the doctors, the people on the ground who have the most, the people who would benefit the most uh, from having shared resources, having access to adequate health care and job opportunities, um, having a bigger share of the pay for their labor go to them versus going to these corporate monopolies. These are the people who we should be looking toward as leadership for this transition from these broken down countries into forming a national federated state. This has to be led by the working class, the working people. There's never going to be bourgeois leadership or a wealthy puppet put in place, or you're not going to get the results that you want in a colonial setting by using the means that are put in place by the ruling class. This is just not going to happen. All right, so Diop makes it clear that these elite government and corporate leaders hold the interests of the colonialists, so the exploited people have to create their own leadership. Leadership for this type of revolutionary change has to come from the masses of the population, the everyday, like I said, working day, everyday working class people have to take up the mantle of leadership. There has to be training, education. There has to be development along moral and mental lines to prepare someone who comes from the people to do the necessary things that it's going to take to actually get from under colonialism. He talks about foreign aid also. That's another piece. He goes into foreign aid and how African leadership has to first begin the internal struggle toward development without relying on resources from outside of the continent. Africa is politically dominated by foreign interests, and therefore, to end political domination, you first have to end economical domination. So as long as African countries are still accepting foreign aid, African countries are still, in relationships, or still have relationships with these colonial governments, they're going to be politically dominated by them. So it's essentially, if you want our money, you're going to have to put one of our leaders in place. So until we cut that first tie of political domination, we have to, first show where, as a people, we can develop without a necessary need for the economical support from the outside. And I think this is something that comes down the line after the change of power takes place. I don't think there's any African country right now that's totally prepared to break economic ties with any of the former colonial governments or neo-colonial governments. So I think this point that he's discussing is something that would have to come, down the line. Again, he wrote this sometime between the 40s and the 60s. Um, I bet if he was alive today, he would be pissed to see the state of Africa. Anyhow, let's keep going on. He goes into the importance of developing technologically, scientifically and technologically, just like other European and Asian nations have. National liberation is a question of scientific and technological ability. So this is something that this generation, again, he wrote this 1940, 1960, and he said that this is something that this generation has to grasp. Here we are, it's 2020. I believe scientifically, technologically, if we, I did some investigating online and I found that out of all the scientists in the world, there are roughly about 4,000 between the US and UK. The entire continent of Africa is home to only 198 scientists. So, roughly about 200 scientists. And out of all of the research and development that's done in the world, only about 1 to 2% of scientific research and development is done in the continent of Africa. This is something that Diop was speaking to. That a nation can't really stand on its own without science and technology. So this is an area that I think the as diasporans who have the greatest scientific and technological education by far than any other Black African people in the world, those from the United States should definitely look at the possibility of delving into ventures on the continent. Diop discussed the cultural unity of Africa. And this is also another interesting topic because you have black African people who would say things like, Africa is not a monolith. There's, hundreds of different languages and cultures on the continent. But what Diop does in his work is dig into the continuity of different cultural aspects of traditions from around the country. From around the continent, and primarily he focuses on the basic familial structure, or the social organization of tribes and families and communities, which matriarchy is one of the, I guess, the most prevalent cultural traits of peoples around the continent of Africa. Leadership and inheritance coming down the mother's side rather than the father's side, or the mother being recognized as the head of the family rather than the father, which is very important. He digs really deep to show the history of how patriarchy developed in different parts of Europe, and then eventually spread into Africa through invasion and colonialization. And Diop says next, he cites the pre-colonial relationship between family, community, and the state. Hierarchy is a European creation that was imposed on Africa with the breakdown of communalism and the rise of feudalist states, which eventually led to the colonialization of Africa and capitalist domination. He gives for us to he would have us to understand matriarchy versus patriarchy, and how patriarchy can lead to elitism. Patriarchy, I would say, opens the door for hierarchy, which basically, this might over right, or how's the saying goes, the strong ruling over the weak. This is a paternalistic. Let me say it again: the strong ruling over the weak. This is a paternalistic mentality that came out of European tribalism and eventually made its way into Africa. It's not inherently Africa. throughout the continent, matriarchy is inherently African. And he also goes back to Kemet again. He goes back to Kemet throughout a lot of his work, emphasizing Kemet as the model or the prototype that we should use as we, develop these ideas for a one African state. Okay, and he closes out with a really strong quote, which I'm going to read directly from the text. It is not a matter of creating from scratch a history more beautiful than that of other people with a view to administration, a moral boost to the people during a period of struggle for independence, but that of proceeding from the generally accepted idea that every people have a history. And he says, I shall continue in my country to devote the best of my time to popularizing the same ideas in order to ensure that the awakening of national consciousness among our people takes place on a solid basis. So we'll close with that. Diop recognizes the continent of Africa as his home. He doesn't just mention Senegal, which is where he hails from, but he looks at Africa in its entirety as his home. And his life's work was devoted toward what we call the African Renaissance. He wanted to uplift Africa through African cultural values, cultural, moral, in infrastructural, scientific, and technological advancement. So these are methods that would be used to sever ties with the colonial regimes that dominate from country to country or locality to locality. He also envisioned removing these lines or these borders that were put in place linguistically, culturally, and historically to reawaken Africa on the world stage as a dominant force within this global economy. That is it. The book again was Toward African Renaissance by Cheikh Anta Diop. I would advise people to check it out. It's a very small text and it goes perfectly well with some of his other works like Black Africa, the economic and cultural basis for a federated state. We'll be wrapping up on that next. Thank you. Please share this and ask questions or give any criticisms that you may have. Thank you and take care.